The escape pod screamed through the atmosphere of Verdantis 7, with flames licking at its heat shields, and Jake Morrison held tight to the crash harness as the small vessel shook violently around him, and he knew this landing was going to hurt badly. But there was nothing else he could do now except pray that the automated systems would keep him alive long enough to hit the ground. The Dominion patrol ships had caught him by surprise while he was doing a routine scout run near the restricted zone, and their plasma cannons had torn through his reconnaissance ship like it was made of paper, and he had barely made it to the pod before the main reactor went critical, and now he was plummeting toward a planet that was supposed to be completely empty and off-limits to everyone in the galaxy for reasons nobody seemed to remember anymore. The pod hit the canopy of the massive jungle, and tree branches as thick as his torso snapped and broke under the impact, and the emergency rockets fired at the last second to slow his descent. But it was not enough, and the pod slammed into the ground with bone-jarring force that made his teeth click together painfully, and his vision went white for several long seconds. When Jake finally managed to unbuckle himself and kick open the pod door, he stumbled out onto soft moss-covered ground and took a deep breath of air that tasted oddly sweet and electric at the same time, and the jungle around him was unlike anything he had ever seen before, with trees that reached hundreds of feet into the sky and plants that seemed to glow with faint bioluminescent light. Even though it was the middle of the day, his suit scanner showed multiple system failures, and his communication gear was completely dead, which meant he was alone on a forbidden world with Dominion ships, probably searching for him right now, and no way to call for help, and the nearest human outpost was 3 star systems away, and he had no ship to get there. Jake checked his survival pack and found it mostly intact with a plasma pistol, water purifier, medkit, ration bars, and a small tent, and he figured he had maybe 2 weeks of supplies if he was careful, but that assumed he could find water and food on this supposedly dead planet, and the energy readings on his scanner told him this place was anything but dead. Strange power signatures were scattered throughout the jungle, and some of them were strong enough to indicate advanced technology, and that made no sense at all, because the treaty that made this world forbidden had been signed 3,000 years ago before humans even had spaceflight, and nobody knew what the treaty was actually protecting anymore. He started walking deeper into the jungle, following a game trail that wound between the massive trees, and the sounds around him were alien and strange, with bird-like creatures calling from the canopy and something large moving through the undergrowth nearby, and his hand moved to his plasma pistol instinctively. After an hour of walking, Jake found something that made his blood run cold, and it was a tree trunk that had strange symbols carved into it, and the symbols were glowing with soft blue light, and they looked like they were written in a language that was both completely alien and somehow familiar at the same time, and when he reached out to touch them, his hand tingled with static electricity. The jungle seemed to react to his presence, and the trees around him began to whisper in voices he could almost understand, and the words sounded like warnings, telling him to leave, to run to go back before it was too late. But he had nowhere to go, and his ship was destroyed, and the Dominion was hunting him. That night, Jake made camp under a large tree with twisted roots that formed a natural shelter, and he set up his tent and ate a ration bar that tasted like cardboard and tried to figure out his next move, and he knew he needed to find a way off this planet, but without communications, he had no way to call for rescue. He was just starting to doze off when he heard something moving outside his tent, and it was big, and the footsteps made the ground shake slightly, and he grabbed his plasma pistol and slowly unzipped the tent flap, and what he saw outside made him freeze in pure terror. A massive creature stood in the clearing, and it was the size of a small building, with scales that shimmered in colors that should not exist, and wings that were folded against its back, and eyes that burned with an intelligence that was clearly not animal. And this thing was clearly a dragon or something, very much like one, and it was staring directly at his tent. Jake did not move and barely breathed, and the dragon tilted its massive head as if studying him with curiosity rather than hunger, and then it made a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a purr, and the sound vibrated through his chest and made his bones ache. Then a voice spoke from the darkness, and it was female and spoke perfect English with an accent he could not place, and she said, "You should not be here." Human. And Jake spun around to see a woman stepping out from behind a tree, and she was the most beautiful and alien thing he had ever seen. She had pointed ears and skin that seemed to glow faintly with its own light, and her eyes were larger than human eyes and filled with swirling colors like nebulas, and she wore clothing that looked like it was made from living metal that shifted and changed as she moved, and strange markings covered her arms and face that pulsed with soft light. The woman moved closer, and her movements were graceful and predatory at the same time, and she studied him with an expression that was hard to read, and then she spoke again, saying, "This world is forbidden to your kind, and you must leave immediately before they find you here, and before you see things you were never meant to see." Jake raised his hands slowly to show he meant no harm, and he said his ship was destroyed, and he had no way to leave, and he needed help. And the woman tilted her head in a gesture that reminded him of the dragon, and she seemed to be considering something. The dragon made another rumbling sound, and the woman glanced at it and seemed to understand something, and then she looked back at Jake with an expression of resignation, and she said, "The damage is already done, and you have already seen too much, and the Dominion ships above are searching for something, and they will find this place eventually because of you." Jake felt a spike of fear at her words, and he asked what place, and what was she hiding here, and why was this planet really forbidden? And the woman was quiet for a long moment, and then she turned and began walking away, and over her shoulder she said, "Follow me if you want to live through the night, but understand that once you see what I am about to show you, there will be no going back, and your life will never be the same." Jake hesitated for only a second, and then he grabbed his pack and followed her into the dark jungle, and the massive dragon launched itself into the air with a sound like thunder and followed them from above, and he could see its shadow moving through the canopy and blocking out the stars. They walked for what felt like hours through the increasingly strange jungle, and the plants became more alien and technological-looking, and Jake began to see structures hidden among the trees, and they were covered in vines and moss, but clearly artificial, and built with technology far beyond anything humans possessed. Finally, they came to a massive clearing, and in the center of it was something that made Jake stop in his tracks and stare in complete disbelief. And it was a starship, but unlike any ship he had ever seen, and it was beautiful and terrifying. At the same time, the ship was easily a mile long and shaped like a work of art rather than a war machine, and its hull was made of a crystalline material that caught the moonlight and reflected it in prismatic patterns, and the whole thing was covered in a shimmering field that bent light around it and made it nearly invisible, and the energy signature coming from it was enormous. The woman turned to face him, and her expression was sad and ancient, and she said, "Welcome to the last refuge of the Luminary Empire, and I am Princess Kalith, and that ship is my home and my prison. And you human have just walked into the middle of a war that ended 3,000 years ago, but is about to begin again." Jake stared at the massive crystalline starship and tried to process what Princess Kalith had just told him, and a war that ended 3,000 years ago made no sense, and he had never heard of the Luminary Empire in any history database, and the ship before him looked like it could destroy entire fleets, but it sat hidden in a jungle on a forbidden world. Kalith watched him carefully, and her alien eyes seemed to see right through him, and she said, "You are confused, and that is understandable because your people were not supposed to know about us, and the Dominion has spent millennia erasing every trace of my civilization from galactic memory, and they did a thorough job of it." The dragon landed behind Kalith with a sound that shook the ground, and it folded its massive wings and made a low rumbling sound that seemed almost protective, and Kalith reached up without looking and placed her hand on its scaled snout, and she said, "This is Vorthrax, and he is one of only 3 war dragons left in the entire universe. And he has been with me for longer than your entire species has had written language. Jake felt his mind struggling to accept what he was hearing, and he asked how old she was, and Caliph smiled sadly and said old enough to remember when this galaxy had 17 major civilizations instead of the 3 that exist now, and old enough to have watched 14 of them fall to the Dominion or be absorbed by it, and old enough to know that humanity should not exist yet. That last statement made Jake take a step back, and he demanded to know what she meant. And Caliph gestured for him to follow her toward the ship, and as they walked, she began to explain, and her voice took on the tone of someone telling a story they had told themselves 1,000 times. She said that 3,000 years ago the Luminari Empire was the dominant power in the galaxy, and they were not conquerors but rather guardians, and they used their advanced technology and psionic abilities to maintain peace and balance, and they helped younger species develop and protected them from threats both external and internal. But the Luminari had an enemy, and they were a faction that believed the Empire was too weak and too merciful, and this faction wanted to dominate other species rather than guide them. And they called themselves the Ascendant Dominion, and they believed that only the strongest had the right to rule. The war that followed lasted for 200 years, and it was brutal beyond imagination, and entire star systems were destroyed, and billions died, and the Luminari fought with honor and mercy. And that was their fatal weakness, and the Dominion fought without restraint, and used forbidden weapons and psionic warfare that drove entire populations insane. In the end, the Luminary Empire fell, and Caliph was one of the few survivors, and she escaped with Vorthrax and her personal dreadnought, and she fled to this hidden world that her people had prepared as a refuge, in case the worst ever happened, and she has been here ever since, slowly repairing her ship and waiting for the right time to act. Jake listened to all of this, and his tactical mind was already seeing the implications, and he asked why the Dominion had not found her in 3,000 years. And Caliph said this planet is protected by ancient technology that makes it invisible to most scanning methods, and the treaties that forbid access to this world were actually put in place by the Dominion themselves because they knew something was hidden here but could not find it. She continued saying that the Dominion has spent 3 millennia consolidating power and rewriting history and claiming luminary technology as their own, and they rule the galaxy now with an iron fist disguised as benevolent oversight, and most species believe the Dominion has always been the primary power and have no idea that they are living under the rule of those who committed genocide. Jake felt anger rising in his chest at the injustice of it all, and then he remembered something she had said earlier, and he asked what she meant about humanity not supposed to exist yet. And Caliph stopped walking and turned to face him fully. She said that 12,000 years ago, the Luminari seeded certain worlds with genetic material designed to eventually evolve into psionic immune species, and this was a failsafe against psionic domination, and Earth was one of those worlds, and humans were supposed to remain in primitive development for another 1,000 years to allow the immunity to fully develop before achieving spaceflight. But something went wrong, and humanity developed faster than expected, and they reached space early, and now they are out in the galaxy, before they are ready and before the Dominion realizes what they truly are. And when the Dominion figures out that humans are immune to psionic control, they will see humanity as a threat and will try to eliminate them. Jake felt his world shifting under his feet, and everything he thought he knew about human history and humankind's place in the galaxy was suddenly questionable, and he asked if there were other species like humans, and Caliph nodded and said yes, and there were 12 seeded worlds, but only 2 others survived to spaceflight, and one of them is the Karath, who are now enslaved by the Dominion and used as shock troops. They reached the entrance to the ship, and Caliph placed her hand on a panel that glowed at her touch, and the door opened silently and revealed an interior that was breathtaking, and the walls seemed to be made of living light, and the corridors stretched away into impossible distances, and everything hummed with barely contained power. As they walked through the ship, Kalith explained that she had been working for centuries to repair the damage from her escape, and the ship was nearly operational now, and she needed only a few more critical components. And then she could leave this world and begin the next phase of her plan. Jake asked what her plan was, and Kalith said she intended to find the other hidden luminary installations that were scattered across the galaxy and recover the weapons and technology stored there. And then she would reveal the truth about the Dominion to the other species and start a rebellion. It sounded insane and suicidal, and yet Jake found himself wanting to help, and there was something about Kalith and her cause that called to him on a level he did not fully understand, and he had always hated bullies and tyrants, and the Dominion sounded like the worst kind of both. They entered a large chamber that appeared to be a command center, and holographic displays showed tactical information and star charts, and Kalith pulled up an image of the local space around Verdantis 7, and Jake saw multiple red dots that represented Dominion ships. And there were a lot of them. Kalith said grimly that the Dominion had been increasing their patrols in this sector for the past month, and she suspected they were searching for something, and now with your crash, they have an excuse to send landing parties to the surface, and they will eventually find this place. Jake realized with a sinking feeling that he might have just doomed the last princess of an extinct empire, and he started to apologize. But Kalith held up a hand and said it was not his fault, and this confrontation was inevitable, and perhaps it is better to face it now, rather than wait and wonder. Vorthrax had followed them into the ship, and the massive dragon barely fit in the corridors, but he moved with surprising grace, and now he made a sound that was clearly a warning, and Kalith immediately turned to a display and her expression became tense. Multiple Dominion dropships were entering the atmosphere, and they were heading toward different locations around the jungle, and they were deploying search teams, and it would only be a matter of hours before they found the ship. Jake made a decision in that moment, and he said he would help her defend this place, and Kalith looked at him with surprise and said he did not understand what he was offering, and he would be making himself an enemy of the Dominion, and he would never be able to return to human space. Jake met her alien eyes and said he understood, and he had been a soldier for most of his adult life, and he knew what it meant to fight for something bigger than himself. And besides, he added with a grim smile he was probably already considered dead after his ship was destroyed, so he had nothing to lose. Kalith studied him for a long moment, and then something shifted in her expression, and she nodded and said, "Very well, human, and if you are going to fight beside me, then you need to understand what you are facing." And she pulled up tactical data on Dominion forces and their weapons and their tactics. Jake absorbed the information quickly, and his military training kicked in, and he began to see patterns and weaknesses, and he started suggesting defensive positions and ambush points and ways to use the jungle terrain to their advantage. Kalith watched him work and seemed impressed, and she said, "Humans are natural tactical thinkers." And that was one of the traits her people had tried to breed into the seeded species, and it appears to have worked well. As they planned their defense, Jake activated his emergency beacon, and Kalith looked at him sharply and asked what he had done, and Jake said he was calling for backup, and if there were any human ships in range, they would respond to a distress signal. Kalith looked alarmed and said that could bring more trouble, and Jake said, or it could bring allies, and besides, the Dominion already knows someone is here, so they might as well even the odds. The princess was quiet for a moment, and then she said she hoped he knew what he was doing, and Jake hoped so too. The Dominion assault began at dawn, and it started with orbital bombardment that lit up the jungle canopy with plasma fire, and trees exploded into flames, and the ground shook with each impact, and Jake watched from a defensive position as dropships descended through the smoke and began deploying troops in a wide perimeter around the hidden starship. Kalith had activated the defense systems, and ancient weapons emerged from hidden positions throughout the jungle, and energy beams lanced out and destroyed 2 dropships before they could land, and Dominion soldiers scattered for cover as automated turrets tracked them with inhuman precision. Vorthrax launched himself from the top of the crystalline ship with a roar that sounded like thunder, and his scales seemed to ripple with impossible colors as he dove toward a cluster of Dominion troops, and plasma breath erupted from his jaws and turned soldiers into ash, and their screams were cut short. Jake had been given a luminary rifle by Calith, and the weapon was lighter than any human gun, but packed more power than anything he had ever used, and he sighted down on a Dominion squad leader and squeezed the trigger, and the energy bolt punched through the alien armor like paper and dropped him instantly. The Dominion forces were well-trained and equipped with advanced weapons, but they had not expected this level of resistance, and their tactical net was being jammed by Luminary technology, and their commanders were struggling to coordinate their forces effectively. Jake moved through the jungle using every trick he had learned in years of combat, and he hit Dominion positions from unexpected angles and used the terrain to his advantage, and every time they tried to pin him down, he was already gone and hitting them from somewhere else. Calith fought alongside him, and her psionic abilities allowed her to sense enemy positions before they revealed themselves, and she moved with inhuman speed and grace, and her weapon never seemed to miss, and Jake found himself constantly impressed by her combat skills. Hours into the battle, Jake heard the distinctive sound of human engines, and he looked up to see 3 human dropships breaking through the clouds, and they bore the markings of the Earth Defense Force, and his emergency beacon had been answered faster than he had dared to hope. The human ships immediately engaged the Dominion forces and added their firepower to the chaotic battle, and Jake saw figures in human combat armor deploying from the ships and taking up positions, and he felt a surge of relief that he was no longer facing impossible odds alone. A woman in commander insignia made her way to Jake's position, and she had short dark hair and sharp eyes, and she said her name was Lisa Hayes, and she demanded to know what the hell was going on and why a human scout was fighting alongside an unknown alien on a forbidden world. Jake gave her the shortest version he could, and he told her about Calith and the Luminary Empire and the Dominion genocide and the ancient starship hidden in the jungle, and Lisa listened with an expression that shifted from skepticism to shock to grim determination. Lisa said her orders had been to extract Jake and get out, but this changed everything, and if what he said was true, then humanity needed to know about it, and she made a quick decision and ordered her troops to reinforce the defensive perimeter and support the fight against the Dominion. Another woman appeared, and she wore intelligence officer insignia, and her name was Amy Chen, and Jake recognized her as someone he had served with years ago, and she immediately began scanning the area with portable equipment, and when she saw the readings from the Luminary ship, her eyes went wide. Amy said, "This technology was centuries beyond anything humanity possessed, and if they could study it, then it would revolutionize everything humans knew about physics and engineering and propulsion." And Lisa said first, they had to survive long enough to make that happen. The battle intensified as more Dominion forces arrived, and they had clearly decided that whatever was hidden here was worth a major commitment of resources, and heavy assault mechs began dropping from orbit, and their weapon systems were designed specifically to counter Dragon-scale armor. Vorthrax screamed in pain as an anti-dragon weapon hit him and burned through his scales, and he crashed into the jungle, and Calith cried out and ran toward him, and Jake followed her, and they found the massive dragon bleeding from multiple wounds but still alive. Calith placed her hands on Vorthrax's wounds, and they began to glow. And Jake watched in amazement as the injuries started to heal, and she said the bond between Luminary and Dragon allowed for healing, but it drained her strength, and she would be vulnerable for a time. Jake took up a defensive position over them and fired at any Dominion soldier who tried to approach, and his Luminary rifle burned through their armor with each shot, and Lisa and her troops formed a protective circle and held the line against wave after wave of attackers. Amy had made her way to the Luminary ship and gained access to the exterior data ports, and she began downloading everything she could, and the information flowing into her equipment was staggering, and she saw files about galactic history and technology and the true nature of the Dominion, and she knew this data would change everything. Inside, the ship systems were coming online that had been dormant for millennia, and Calith had programmed them to activate automatically if the ship came under direct attack. And now ancient weapons were powering up, and the entire ship began to glow with barely contained energy. Jake felt the air around him change and charge with static electricity, and he looked up to see the crystalline hull of the ship beginning to pulse with light. And Calith smiled grimly and said the dreadnought was waking up, and now the Dominion would see what luminary power truly meant. Energy beams erupted from the ship in every direction, and they were far more powerful than the defense turrets. And they swept across the battlefield and destroyed Dominion mechs and dropships and even damaged the orbital ships above, and the tide of battle suddenly shifted. The Dominion forces began to retreat, and their commanders realized they were facing something beyond their ability to handle. And they fell back to their landing zones and scrambled to evacuate, and within minutes the battlefield was clear except for burning wreckage and the bodies of fallen soldiers. Lisa stood next to Jake and surveyed the destruction, and she said this was going to cause a major incident and the Dominion would demand answers. And Earth would be caught in the middle. And Jake said Earth needed to choose a side, and Lisa said she hoped Command would make the right choice. Calith approached them, and Vorthrax limped behind her, and the dragon was healing, but still weak, and she said this was only the beginning, and the Dominion would return with greater force, and next time they would bring weapons designed specifically to destroy her ship, and they needed to leave this world as soon as possible. Amy came running from the ship, and her face was flushed with excitement, and she said she had found something incredible in the database, and there were coordinates for 6 other hidden luminary installations scattered across the galaxy, and each one contained weapons and technology, and potentially more dragons. Calith confirmed this and said that had been the plan if the luminary ever fell, and they had hidden caches of their most powerful assets in case survivors needed to rebuild, and she had spent centuries searching for them, but many of the coordinates were lost or corrupted. Amy said her equipment had recovered most of the data, and they now had a map to incredible power. And Lisa looked at Calith and said, if humans helped recover these installations, what would Calith offer in return? Calith met Lisa's gaze and said she would offer alliance and technology and knowledge, and most importantly, she would offer the truth about the Dominion and proof of their crimes, and together they could challenge the corrupt order that ruled the galaxy. Lisa was quiet for a long moment, and then she said she needed to contact Earth Command and get authorization, and Calith said there was no time for bureaucracy, and the Dominion was mobilizing their full fleet, and they would arrive within days, and this world would be destroyed and everyone on it killed. Jake said he was staying with Calith, regardless of what Earth decided, and Lisa looked at him and shook her head and said he was still the same reckless fool she remembered, and then she smiled and said she was staying too, and she would face court-martial if necessary, but this was too important to walk away from. Amy agreed and said she wanted to study the luminary technology and learn everything she could, and several other human soldiers volunteered as well, and they all understood they were burning bridges and making themselves fugitives, but they also understood they were part of something historic. Calith looked at the assembled humans, and something like hope entered her ancient eyes, and she said, the luminary had seeded humanity for exactly this reason, and humans had courage and adaptability and moral clarity that her own people had lost in their final years, and perhaps together they could build something better than either civilization alone. The ship systems fully activated, and the crystalline hull blazed with light, and Calith said they needed to leave immediately and head for the nearest installation, and Jake asked what they would find there, and Calith smiled and said they would find a forge capable of creating new war dragons, and if they could claim it, then they would have the power to truly challenge the Dominion. The luminary dreadnought, which Calith had named Starfire, broke through the atmosphere of Verdantis 7 and jumped to faster-than-light speed, and the human crew aboard watched in amazement as the ship moved with a grace and power that made their own vessels seem like children toys. In comparison, Jake stood in the command center beside Calith and watched the star charts shift as they traveled toward the coordinates of the hidden forge, and the journey would take 3 days, even at the incredible speeds the Luminari ship could achieve, and during that time they would need to prepare for whatever they would find. There, Lisa had taken command of the human contingent and was organizing them into effective units that could work alongside Luminari technology, and Amy was spending every waking moment studying the ship systems and trying to understand the principles behind them, and her reports back to Earth were causing quite a stir among the scientific community. Vorthrax had recovered from his wounds and now spent most of his time in a large chamber that had been designed specifically for dragons, and he would watch Jake with those ancient, intelligent eyes whenever the human passed by, and there was something unsettling about the attention. On the second day of their journey, Calith approached Jake and said they needed to talk about something important, and she led him to the dragon chamber, and Vorthrax raised his massive head and studied Jake with what seemed like curiosity. Calith explained that luminary royalty had always bonded with dragons through a ritual that connected their minds and souls, and this bond granted enhanced abilities to both partners and allowed them to fight as one unit. And now, with the luminary nearly extinct, the dragons needed new partners. She said Vorthrax had chosen Jake, and the dragon saw something in him that resonated with the ancient warrior spirit that all dragons carried. And if Jake agreed to undergo the bonding ritual, then he would become the first human dragon rider in history. Jake looked at the massive creature and felt both fear and excitement, and he asked what the ritual involved, and Calith said it required Jake to open his mind completely and allow Vorthrax to enter his consciousness and share memories and emotions, and if Jake's mind was not strong enough, he could be destroyed. But she also said that humans had psionic immunity, which meant Jake's mind was uniquely suited to resist the overwhelming power of a dragon consciousness. And this was probably why Vorthrax had chosen him, and together they could become something unprecedented. Jake thought about it for only a moment, and then agreed, and Calith smiled and said she had expected nothing less, and she began preparing the ritual chamber with crystalline focuses that would channel the bonding energy. The ritual itself was beyond anything Jake could have imagined, and when Vorthrax's consciousness touched his own, it felt like being hit by a tidal wave of memories and emotions that stretched back thousands of years, and he saw battles and worlds and the fall of the Luminari Empire through the dragon eyes. But Jake did not break, and his human mind, with its natural psionic resistance, held firm against the onslaught, and gradually the two consciousnesses began to merge and find balance, and Jake could feel Vorthrax's strength flowing into him and his own tactical mind flowing into the dragon. When the ritual ended, Jake collapsed to the floor, and Calith caught him and helped him stand, and when he opened his eyes he could see energy patterns that had been invisible before, and he could sense Vorthrax's emotions as clearly as his own, and the bond between them hummed with power. Calith said the bonding had worked better than she had dared hope, and now Jake had abilities that would make him a formidable warrior, and he would heal faster and move with enhanced speed and have limited telepathy with Vorthrax, and most importantly, he could ride the dragon in combat. They reached the forge on the third day, and it was a massive orbital station hidden behind a moon in a dead system, and the structure was easily 10 miles across and covered in the same crystalline material as the Starfire. And when they approached its ancient systems, recognized the dreadnought, and activated automatically. Lisa ordered combat readiness, because this seemed too easy, and her instincts were proven right when Dominion ships suddenly appeared from behind the moon and began firing, and it was clear they had been waiting and watching the forge for a long time. General Vexthor's voice came over the communication channel, and he said the Dominion had anticipated that any Luminary survivor would eventually come to the Forge, and they had set a trap, and now Kalith and her human allies would be destroyed. The space battle was intense and brutal, and Dominion ships outnumbered them 5-1. But the Starfire was a dreadnought, and its weapons tore through enemy vessels with terrifying efficiency, and Lisa coordinated the human fighters to protect the larger ship flanks, and they proved surprisingly effective against the more rigid Dominion tactics Jake and Vorthrax launched from the ship bay, and the Dragon breathed plasma across a Dominion cruiser and melted through its hull, and Jake used his bond to guide their movements with precision that made them nearly impossible to target. But then Jake saw something that made his heart stop, and it was a small fighter with Earth markings engaging Dominion forces but fighting on their side, and when he enhanced the image, he recognized the pilot, and it was Katie Morrison, and she was his sister, and he had not seen her in 5 years. Katie had left Earth to become a mercenary, and the last Jake had heard she was working in the outer colonies, but apparently she had ended up working for the Dominion, and now she was trying to kill him without even knowing it. Jake opened a private channel and said, "Katie name." And there was a long pause, and then his sister voice came back and she sounded shocked and said she thought he was dead, and Jake said he almost was. But things had gotten complicated and he needed her to stand down. Katie said she was under contract with the Dominion, and they paid well, and Jake said they were also genocidal tyrants who had erased an entire civilization from history, and he transmitted some of the data Amy had recovered and told her to look at it. There was silence on the channel, and Jake could imagine Katie reviewing the information and trying to process it. And finally, she said, "This changed things, and if what he was showing her was real, then she had been working for the wrong side." Katie broke formation and turned her fighter toward the Starfire, and several Dominion ships tried to stop her, but she was one of the best pilots Jake had ever known, and she evaded their fire and docked with the Luminary ship. The battle continued, but the Dominion forces were being pushed back, and finally General Vexthor ordered a retreat and said this was not over, and he would hunt them across the galaxy if necessary. And Kalith responded by saying she was counting on it. With the Dominion gone, they approached the Forge and docked, and Kalith led a team inside, including Jake and Lisa and Amy and Katie, who was still processing everything that had happened. The interior of the Forge was breathtaking, and massive chambers stretched away in every direction, and they were filled with genetic tanks and manufacturing equipment, and most importantly, 3 massive crystalline eggs that pulsed with inner light. Kalith approached the eggs reverently and said these were dragon eggs in stasis, and they had been waiting here for 3,000 years, for riders worthy of bonding with them, and the Forge AI could accelerate their growth and produce fully mature dragons in weeks, instead of decades. Amy immediately began interfacing with the Forge systems, and she said the AI contained complete specifications for Luminary technology and weapons and ships, and if they could get this information back to Earth, it would revolutionize human civilization. But the AI also had a warning, and it said the Luminary Empire had fallen because they became complacent and believed their power made them invincible. And they stopped questioning themselves and stopped adapting, and that weakness had been their doom. Kalith listened to this with a pained expression and said her people had known they were failing, but pride had prevented them from asking for help, and by the time they realized how serious the threat was, it had been too late. Lisa said humanity would not make that mistake, and humans were good at adapting and learning, and they had survived countless wars and disasters by being flexible. And Jake added that humans also knew how to build alliances instead of trying to do everything alone. The Forge AI said it would produce 3 new dragons, and they would need 3 riders. And Kalith said Jake was already bonded to Vorthrax, so they needed 2 more. And Lisa immediately volunteered and said she had always wanted to fly. Amy volunteered as well and said if she was going to study dragon biology, she might as well do it from the inside, and Katie said she wanted in too. But Kalith said only 3 eggs were viable and Katie would have to wait. They activated the forge, and the eggs began to grow and mature, and the AI said the process would take 2 weeks, and during that time they should prepare for what was coming because the Dominion would not give up easily. Jake spent the time training with Vorthrax and learning to fight as a bonded pair, and their coordination improved daily, and he could feel his abilities growing stronger as the bond deepened. Kalith watched him train, and there was something in her eyes that went beyond respect or friendship, and Jake found himself drawn to her as well, and the cultural differences between human and luminary seemed less important than the connection they shared. On the 13th day, the Dominion made their move, and they came with their entire fleet, and hundreds of ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel around the forge, and General Vexthor's voice echoed across every channel saying, "Surrender or be destroyed." Jake stood in the command center of the forge and watched the Dominion fleet surround them, and the situation looked hopeless. But he had been in hopeless situations before, and somehow humanity always found a way through, and this time would be no different. Lisa was coordinating defensive positions, and Amy was frantically working to upload all the forge data to multiple backup systems in case they had to destroy the station, and Kalith stood beside Jake, and her expression was calm. Despite the overwhelming odds, the 3 new dragons had just emerged from their growth chambers, and they were smaller than Vorthrax, but still massive and powerful, and Lisa and Amy and a human marine named Beth Palmer prepared to undergo the bonding ritual. Even though there was no time for the proper ceremony, Kalith said the rushed bonding would be dangerous, but they had no choice, and the 3 humans agreed, and within hours they were connected to their dragons, and Jake could feel the new bonds forming through his connection with Vorthrax, and it was like watching stars being born. But something else was happening, and Katie had discovered it while monitoring long-range communications, and she said the Dominion was broadcasting a message to every world in the galaxy, and it was a declaration that they had found and were destroying the last remnants of a terrorist organization that threatened galactic peace. Jake realized this was their chance, and he said they needed to hijack that broadcast and show the galaxy the truth, and Amy said she could do it if she could access the Forge main transmitter, and the AI said it was possible, but would leave them vulnerable during the transmission. Kalith made the decision, and she said they would broadcast everything and all the data Amy had recovered, and all the proof of Dominion genocide, and all the evidence of their crimes, and even if they died here, the truth would survive. Lisa organized the defense, while Amy worked on the transmission, and Jake and the other dragon riders prepared to launch and buy time, and Vorthrax was eager for battle, and Jake could feel the dragon battle fury through their bond. The Dominion attacked, and their ships came in waves and tried to overwhelm the Forge defenses through sheer numbers, and the Starfire fought alongside the Forge guns and carved through enemy vessels. But there were too many, and they kept coming. Jake and Vorthrax launched into space, and the other 3 dragons followed, and Lisa rode a silver dragon she had named Stormwind, and Amy rode a blue dragon called Tidecaller, and Beth rode a red dragon named Fireborn, and together the 4 dragons tore through Dominion formations. The bond allowed the riders to coordinate perfectly, and they fought as one unit and used tactics that no Dominion commander had ever seen before because they combined human unpredictability with dragon power and luminary technology. General Vexthor led the assault personally in a massive command ship, and he ordered his forces to concentrate fire on the dragons, and they deployed specialized weapons designed specifically to kill dragonkind, and these weapons had been created during the ancient war. Vorthrax took a direct hit and screamed in pain, and Jake felt the agony through their bond, but he held on and guided the dragon away from the worst of the fire, and Lisa Stormwind covered them and breathed plasma across the weapon platform and destroyed it. Amy completed the transmission, and suddenly every communication channel in the galaxy was carrying the same signal, and it showed footage of the Luminari Empire in its glory, and then showed the Dominion attack and the systematic genocide and the cover-up that followed. The transmission showed 3,000 years of lies and manipulation and oppression, and it showed the enslaved species that the Dominion controlled, and it showed the truth about the Luminari seeding program, and how humans were meant to be a failsafe against tyranny worlds across the galaxy, received the transmission, and saw the truth, and reactions were immediate and varied, and some species refused to believe it, and some were shocked, and some were angry, and some had suspected all along. The enslaved Karath species saw the transmission and learned that they were descended from a Luminari seeding project just like humans, and they had been enslaved for 3,000 years by the very beings who had destroyed their creators, and rage swept through their population. Karath soldiers serving in the Dominion fleet began to rebel and turn their weapons on their masters, and ships that had been attacking the forge suddenly turned and began fighting against other Dominion vessels, and the tide of battle shifted dramatically. More ships arrived, and these bore human markings, and it was a fleet from Earth led by carriers and dreadnoughts, and Lisa received a message from Earth Command saying they had chosen their side and humanity would stand with the last Luminary princess against the Dominion. Katie launched in her fighter alongside human pilots, and she said she was done working for the wrong side, and now she would fight for something that actually mattered, and Jake felt pride in his sister courage. The battle became a three-way fight, and the Dominion against the humans and Luminary and the rebelling Karath and the Forge became a rallying point for everyone who wanted freedom from Dominion control. General Vexthor realized he was losing, and he made a desperate move, and he targeted Kalith directly with an assassination strike team that boarded the Forge, and Jake and Vorthrax rushed back to defend her. They found Kalith fighting in the command center, and she was surrounded by Dominion elite soldiers, but she fought with both weapons and psionic power, and bodies lay scattered around her, but more kept coming. Jake and Vorthrax crashed through the wall, and the dragon plasma breath filled the room and cleared the immediate threats, and Jake rushed to Kalith's side, and she was wounded but alive, and she smiled at him and said she knew he would come. General Vexthor appeared, and he was ancient and twisted and kept alive by forbidden technology, and he said Kalith was the last obstacle to complete Dominion control, and with her death, the Luminari would truly be extinct. But Kalith laughed, and said she was not the last Luminari anymore, and she had found something better, and she had found allies and friends, and perhaps even love, and together they were building something new. Jake and Kalith fought Vexthor together, and their combined abilities were more than the ancient general could handle, and his forbidden technology failed, and his body began to break down. But he managed to escape through a personal teleporter and vanished with a promise that this was not over. The Dominion fleet broke apart, and some ships retreated while others surrendered, and the Karath rebels claimed several vessels and declared their independence, and human ships secured the forge and began rendering aid. In the aftermath, Lisa contacted representatives from multiple species who had seen the transmission and wanted to discuss forming a new galactic government based on cooperation instead of domination, and she suggested calling it the Free Worlds Council. Amy had recovered so much data from the Forge that human scientists would be studying it for decades, and she had already identified locations of 4 more Luminari installations, and Kalith said they should visit all of them and recover everything they could. Katie reconciled with Jake and said she was sorry for working with the Dominion, and Jake said everyone made mistakes, and what mattered was what you did after you learned the truth. 6 months passed, and the galaxy had changed dramatically, and the Dominion had fractured into multiple factions, and some tried to maintain control while others reformed and asked for forgiveness, and the Free Worlds Council grew stronger every day. The Starfire led a fleet of mixed human and Karath and reformed Dominion ships, and they had recovered 3 more Luminary installations and trained new dragon riders from multiple species. and what had started as one princess and one dragon had become a movement. Jake and Calith had grown closer, and their relationship had deepened into something profound, and they were the first human luminary couple in history, and their bond was seen as a symbol of the new era. Calith had found other luminary survivors who had been hiding across the galaxy, and slowly they were emerging and sharing their knowledge and rebuilding their culture, and she was no longer the last of her kind. Jake trained new dragon riders and taught them human tactics combined with luminary technology, and Vorthrax was patient with the younger dragons, and the bond between human and dragon became something many species sought. One day they received a transmission from deep space, and it was in ancient luminary, and the message said the first enemy awakens, and the Dominion was only keeping watch, and you have doomed us all. Vorthrax reacted with primal fear, and Calith's face went pale, and she said there had been something before the Dominion and before the Luminary, and it was an enemy so terrible that entire civilizations had united to imprison it. She said the Dominion had kept that secret and maintained the prison unknowingly, and now with the Dominion fractured, the prison seals were failing, and something ancient and hungry was waking up. Jake looked at the gathered crew and the allied fleet and the new dragon riders, and he said they had faced impossible odds before and won, and they would face this new threat together, and they had something the ancients did not have. They had unity and cooperation and species working together, instead of alone, and humans and luminary and Karath and reformed, dominion, and free worlds all standing as one, and whatever was coming would find them ready. Calith took his hand and smiled and said he was right, and together they were stronger than anything that had come before, and the future was unwritten, and they would face it with courage. The transmission ended with coordinates to the ancient prison, and Jake said they should investigate, and Calith agreed, and the Starfire turned toward unknown space, and the crew prepared for whatever they would find. Vorthrax roared, and the other dragons answered, and their voices echoed through the ship, and it sounded like a promise and a warning and a declaration that this new alliance would not fall. The stars stretched before them, and new challenges awaited, but Jake and Calith and their allies were ready, and humanity had found its place in the galaxy not as conquerors or subjects, but as partners and bridge builders and dragon riders. And somewhere in the darkness, something ancient stirred and began to wake.